January 17,
We must secure this
1940,
position before the
Tokyo.
American fleet arrives.
Imperial
I
Army
agree.
General Staff
timing
Headquarters.
is
The
critical.
air inside the briefing room hung thick with cigarette smoke and the faint scent of green tea gone cold. Outside, snow dusted the rooftops of the capital.
As you can
Silent
see, the
and
defenses are
indifferent.
concentrated
Inside,
here,
a dozen
leaving the north
officers
an
in
exposed
crisp
flank.
uniforms bent
We
over
agree with your
maps and
assessment.
intelligence folders, their faces
This position
illuminated
must
by
be
the
secured
pale
by
winter
dawn.
light filtering through
Understood,
rice
General.
paper screens.
It shall be
On the
done.
table before them lay photographs, grainy images of American soldiers at training camps in Georgia, California, Louisiana. Young men in rumpled fatigues, laughing, eating from tin
And then the
trays,
lieutenant
playing
realized he was wearing his
baseball in
helmet
the dirt
backwards.
between
We
drills.
almost died
One
laughing.
Japanese intelligence
did that?
analyst,
No
a
wonder we got
thin-faced
lost.
major with
Look here,
wire-rimmed
the figures are
glasses,
undeniable.
tapped his
The
finger. On a
strategy is
photograph
sound.
of American
Agreed.
recruits
We
lounging
must
beneath a
finalize the
tree,
report
smoking
immediately.
cigarettes, shirts untucked, he smiled faintly. Soft, he murmured. Undisciplined. They train like schoolboys on holiday. Around the table, heads nodded. This was the prevailing assessment, the consensus that would ripple through Japanese strategic planning for years to come.
We need to
America, the
secure this ridge
analysts
by nightfall.
concluded, was a
But the
nation
northern
of
approach
wealth
is too
and
exposed,
comfort.
sir.
A
He's right,
country
Captain.
whose soldiers
We should move through
lacked
the valley
the
instead.
iron will, the spiritual fortitude, the collective discipline that defined the warriors of Japan. The intelligence reports confirmed it. American
use the big
training
one on that
emphasized individual
This one here.
initiative, decentralized command,
That's the one.
and a troubling obsession with logistics over fighting spirit. The soldiers were fed well too well. They questioned orders, they expected rest, recreation, leave.
We
They
need to
were
clear
not
this
warriors,
path now.
they were
Move it.
clerks in uniform.
Securing the
Factory
line.
workers
Watch
handed
out below.
rifles. Jazz musicians taught to march. Japan's strategists looked at these images and saw what they wanted to see. An opponent who could be broken quickly. A military machine built on
Move out, keep
materialism
moving.
rather than spirit, a nation that would
Watch the
falter
flank.
at the first
Get those
taste of
supplies up
hardship
to the
and
line.
blood. But what they saw was not what existed. What Japanese strategists misread about American training and doctrine was not a flaw in intelligence gathering at war, a failure of
Get those medical
imagination, a
supplies
cultural
loaded now.
blindness
We need
so
this cleared by
profound it
sundown.
would cost Japan dearly in the years to come. They mistook flexibility for weakness. They confused abundance with softness. They saw decentralization and assumed chaos. In every photograph, every report, every intercepted training manual, they found evidence to support their preconception. And in doing so, they missed the
All right,
truth
this might
hiding
sting a
in
little.
plain
You're
sight.
doing fine.
That American military doctrine
How's the
was
fever on
not
bed
broken,
four?
it was revolutionary.
Holding steady,
The roots
Corporal.
of this misunderstanding stretched back decades, woven into the fabric of how each nation understood war itself. In Japan, military training was built on the Bushido code: loyalty, endurance, self-sacrifice unto death. A soldier's worth was measured not by his initiative, but by his obedience, not by his comfort, but by his suffering. Japanese recruits endured brutal hazing rituals, trained with inadequate food rations to build resilience, learned to see death in service to the emperor as the highest honor. The doctrine was rigid, hierarchical, collective. Orders flowed downward like water through stone, unchanging and absolute. It was a system that had served Japan for centuries, a doctrine forged in feudalism and sharpened by decades of conquest in Asia. It worked until it didn't. American doctrine, by contrast, seemed alien, almost anarchic to Japanese eyes. The United States Army in 1940 was emerging from 2 decades of neglect, underfunded and undermanned, still bearing the scars of isolationism. But within that neglect, something unexpected had taken root. American training manuals emphasized mission-type orders, the German concept of Auftragstaktik, where junior officers and even non-commissioned officers were expected to understand the commander's intent and adapt tactics on the ground without waiting for orders. American soldiers were taught to read maps, to think critically, to improvise. At Fort Benning, infantry officers learned combined arms coordination. At Fort Knox, tank crews trained not just to follow orders but to exploit breakthroughs independently. At bases across the country, soldiers were fed 3 hot meals a day, given access to recreation, encouraged to write home to maintain morale. They were treated not as expendable instruments of the state, but as citizens in uniform, individuals whose initiative and judgment mattered. To Japanese observers, this looked like indulgence. It looked like a military afraid to demand sacrifice, unwilling to forge steel through suffering. They saw American soldiers playing softball between drills and concluded they lacked discipline. They saw officers encouraging debate during planning sessions and assumed it meant weak command. They saw the emphasis on logistics, warehouses full of spare parts, supply chains designed for abundance, and interpreted it as proof that American soldiers could not fight without luxury. In Japanese war colleges, instructors used American training footage as example of decadence, of what happened when a nation prioritized comfort over spirit. The lesson was clear. When hardship came, when bullets flew and rations ran low, the Americans would crumble. They had never been tested. They did not know hunger. They did not know sacrifice. But the Japanese strategists had made a fundamental error. They had confused means with ends. They saw the external forms of American training, the recreation, the food, the emphasis on individual welfare, and assumed these were signs of weakness rather than calculated investments in combat effectiveness. They did not understand that well-fed soldiers think more clearly under stress. They did not grasp that treating soldiers as thinking individuals rather than obedient automatons produces junior leaders capable of seizing fleeting opportunities in chaotic battles. They did not comprehend that abundance was not a luxury, it was a weapon. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Then the Philippines, Wake Island, Bataan. In those early months, Japanese predictions seemed validated. American forces reeled, retreated, surrendered. Japanese soldiers, lean and hard and utterly committed, advanced with startling speed. At Bataan, American and Filipino defenders starved, their supply lines severed, their commanders outmaneuvered. The Japanese noted this in their reports. When deprived of their material advantages, the Americans collapsed. But they failed to ask why Bataan fell, not because American soldiers lacked will, but because logistical planning had failed, because peacetime doctrines of colonial defense proved catastrophic against modern combined arms assault. The soldiers fought with desperate courage on empty stomachs and dwindling ammunition, proving not softness but the opposite. Yet Japanese intelligence recorded only the outcome: another American surrender, another confirmation of pre-war assessments. Then came Guadalcanal. August 1942, a steaming jungle island in the Solomon chain, strategically vital, brutally contested. Here, for the first time, Japanese forces encountered not the retreating Americans of the Philippines, but something different. Marines who had trained in amphibious warfare, adapted to jungle fighting, and most critically, who were supplied. The Americans landed with tons of equipment, with rations and ammunition and medical supplies. Japanese commanders watched this and saw the same old weakness: soldiers dependent on their comforts, unable to fight lean. Japanese troops, by contrast, were expected to endure on minimal rations, to live off the land, to prioritize bullets over food. It was the Bushido way. It was supposed to be superior. But in the jungle, this doctrine faltered. Japanese supply lines, stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean, broke down. Japanese soldiers began to starve, not as a training exercise, but in reality. Malnutrition led to disease. Disease led to weakness. Weakness led to defeat. Meanwhile, American forces adapted. Junior officers and NCOAs trained to think independently developed new tactics for jungle warfare without waiting for orders from distant headquarters. They rotated men out of the line regularly to prevent psychological breakdown. They established supply dumps, field hospitals, even brought in hot food when possible. To Japanese soldiers peering through the jungle at American positions, it looked like decadence. But those well-fed, well-supplied Americans kept fighting, kept advancing, while Japanese forces withered. The symbolic object that haunted Japanese survivors of Guadalcanal was not a weapon, but a simple tin can of American rations. Japanese soldiers starving would risk their lives to raid American supply dumps, not for ammunition but for food. They found canned peaches, chocolate bars, cigarettes, coffee. Luxuries unimaginable in the Imperial Army. One Japanese officer, captured later in the war, recalled in his interrogation the moment he opened a captured American ration box and found not just sustenance but variety, quality, abundance. We had been told they were soft because they needed such things, he said, but we realized they were strong because they had such things. A starving man cannot fight well. An army that feeds its soldiers is not weak, it is wise. This wisdom eluded Japanese strategic planning even as the evidence mounted. At Tarawa, at Saipan, at Hiroshima, Japanese defenders fought with fanatical courage, choosing death over surrender, embodying Bushido to its ultimate conclusion. And they were destroyed not because they lacked bravery, but because American doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination, overwhelming firepower, and logistical superiority. American commanders trained to adapt, to bypass strong points, to call in naval, gunfire and air support to keep soldiers fed and supplied even under fire. Japanese commanders, bound by rigid doctrine, launched suicidal banzai charges when defense failed. Spend lives in accordance with a code that valued death over pragmatism. The misreading went deeper than tactics. Japanese strategists had fundamentally misunderstood what American training was building, not obedient soldiers, but thinking soldiers, not men who followed orders unto death, but men who understood why they were fighting and could adapt when plans collapsed. The emphasis on individual initiative, which looked like indiscipline, produced sergeants who could take command when officers fell, privates who could read a tactical situation and act without orders. The emphasis on morale and welfare, which looked like softness, produced soldiers who could endure years of combat across vast distances because they believed the system valued their lives. The emphasis on logistics, which looked like dependence, produced an army that could fight at the end of supply line, stretching across oceans, that could land on hostile shores where everything needed not just to survive but to prevail. By 1945, the gap between expectation and reality had become unbridgeable. Japanese military leadership, steeped in a doctrine that had served them for decades, could not adapt. They still believed in spirit over material, in obedience over initiative, in death over pragmatism, and so they fought on, ordering civilians to commit suicide rather than surrender, training children to fight with bamboo spears, planning a final apocalyptic defense of the home islands. They had misread American training so completely that even facing annihilation, they could not comprehend what they faced. Not an army of soft, undisciplined individualists, but a military system that had weaponized the very qualities Japan had dismissed as weaknesses. The irony was sharp and cruel. Japanese strategists in that smoke-filled room in January 1940 had looked at photographs of American soldiers and seen exactly what they expected to see. They saw their own prejudices reflected back. A wealthy, individualistic, materialistic society that could not produce warriors. They never considered that those laughing young men eating well and playing baseball might be training for a kind of warfare Japan did not yet understand. A warfare of adaptation, innovation, logistical mastery, and yes, individual human dignity treated not as a liability, but as a force multiplier. In the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the burned-out cities and ruined empire of August 1945, the cost of this misreading became final. Japan had gambled its future on assessments made from photographs and prejudice, on doctrine that mistook form for substance, on a failure to imagine that different did not mean inferior. The Americans they dismissed as soft had crossed two oceans, defeated through empires, and done so not despite their training doctrine but because of it. The truth that emerged from the smoke of war was this: strength does not come only from hardship. Discipline does not require cruelty. An army that feeds its soldiers, trusts its junior leaders, and treats its people as thinking individuals is not weak, it is forging a different kind of power, one built not on the brittle rigidity of absolute obedience but on the flexible resilience of 1,000 minds solving problems, adapting, enduring. The Japanese strategists never understood this. They looked at American abundance and saw decadence. They should have seen the future. They mistook a nation's care for its soldiers as softness, when it was in fact a doctrine as calculated and deadly as any code of warriors a doctrine that recognized a simple truth: people fight harder when they know their lives matter, when they are fed and equipped and trained to think, when they are treated not as instruments to be spent, but as citizens to be respected. In the end, what Japanese strategists misread about American training and doctrine was not a detail or a tactic. It was the fundamental nature of power in the modern age that abundance builds strength, that flexibility defeats rigidity, that an army of individuals thinking and adapting will outlast an army of men dying for an unchanging code. They saw softness where there was sophistication. They saw chaos where there was calculated empowerment. They saw weakness where there was a different kind of steel, and they paid for that misreading with everything.